As Erin mentioned, Brooklyn Community Housing and Services, 6 years ago, we began participating in the FUSE program with Corporation for Supportive Housing. The FUSE program, for those of you who don't know, was an effort that was facilitated by Corporation for Supportive Housing, along with the Department of Homeless Services and the Department of Corrections. And the idea was really to try to identify individuals who just kept cycling back and forth between jail and shelter. And the idea was really that if you could provide supportive housing for those individuals with some enhanced services, could you stop that cycle, at least for a good proportion of them? And so FUSE stands for Frequent Users of Services Enhancement. And because of that very lengthy and sort of roundabout title, I think nobody really referred to it that way and just sort of shorthanded it as FUSE from that point forward. The criteria for FUSE, for somebody being eligible for the program, was 445. So an individual had to have a minimum of 4 separate instances of incarceration and 4 separate intakes into the city shelter system within the last 5 years in order to be eligible. And again, that's because the idea was to just get the people who keep going back and forth. BCHS was one of the original not-for-profit agencies that began working on the initiative. And I can tell you in the 6 years that we've been working on the initiative, there's nobody who has had as few as 4 instances of incarceration in the 5 years coming to us. The average, I think, is about 10 or 12 instances of incarceration in the previous 5 years. And we had one very busy gentleman who had 57 incarcerations in the 5-year period before he came to us. And I will add that he has been with us now for 6 years and has maintained his housing. Brooklyn Community Housing and Services, while we are not strictly a mental health agency, that is a lot of what we do. And so, though it was not a requirement of the FUSE program, we decided to focus specifically on the 445s, the individuals who met that criteria, who also had a serious mental health diagnosis. So when we started 6 years ago, or since we've started 6 years ago, we have since taken 27 individuals into the program in that time. 23 of those individuals have maintained their housing or successfully moved on to independent housing, which is an 85% success rate. When we started, we thought if we could be successful with 1/3 of the people, it would be a tremendous success, and that a grand slam would be about 50%. So it really has succeeded well beyond what we imagined for a number of reasons, which I'll go into. One of the things that I'll add, which is very important and sort of reflects some of the challenges of the program, is that in addition to the 85% success rate over 6 years, we've had a 100% success rate in the first year of the program for each new participant. So in other words, for each of the 27 people who've come to us, their first 12 months with us are a success. They've been able to maintain their housing or move on to independent housing. The 4 people of the 27 who subsequently had negative outcomes were either evicted or had a long-term incarceration. That happened in either their 2nd or 3rd year in the program. And in a minute or so, I'll talk about what the implications of that are. What we did was basically a couple of things. So we added a couple of unique components when we started the FUSE program. And then there are a few things that are a little bit unique about our agency that we felt helped the FUSE population as well. The components that we added, so when we started the program, we created a new position, a forensic case manager, who was only going to focus on that population and would have a lower than average caseload. And our second forensic case manager, I think, is here with us today, Thomas Bellinger. So if you have any questions afterwards, he's also available to answer. But we created the forensic case manager position to specifically focus on that population. We also hired a clinical consultant who had an expertise in dealing with individuals with mental health issues who had a history of incarceration. And then we also established a weekly support group that was facilitated by the forensic case manager and the clinical consultant. The clinical consultant would work one-on-one with participants, providing them counseling and therapy. He would also provide supervision and training to the staff, and not just the forensic case manager, but also to all of the staff in our supportive housing program. The support group was extremely important because it helped individuals sort of lose the stigma that comes with being an ex-offender in the community. For many of them, by definition, they hadn't been anywhere other than jail or shelter in a long time, and being able to meet once a week with their peers and talk about the things they were going through, again, really helped them get a sense of normalcy and that what they were doing was manageable and wasn't so strange and necessarily so difficult. So those are the three components that we added when we started the program. The other thing that I think we feel is very important and was very important to the success of the program is something that's an agency-wide focus. And so we put a lot of emphasis in our agency throughout all of our programs in trying to create a sense of community for all of the residents who come to us. So it's front and center in all of our programming and in all of the work that the staff do with the clients. It's also very visible in the design of our housing. So in our SRO, where we house the FUSE program, the housing is set up as suites. So individuals have their own bedrooms, but they share kitchens, living rooms, bathrooms, etc. And then we use that as part of the program model. So the case managers will have regular suite meetings that bring together everybody who lives in the suite, and they talk about all the issues related to living together. And exactly as you can imagine, it covers sort of the gamut of issues. This person, ate my tuna fish sandwich, and, this person, I was going to cook this chicken, and they threw it out. 2, my mental health issue is making it a little difficult for me to get along with the people around me. 2, I think the guy down the hall is relapsing, and you guys should do something about that. And it's really through that process, which is much more challenging for the staff and can be very tedious, but it's really through that process that we feel individuals learn to develop the interpersonal skills that are really necessary for stable and lasting independence, particularly for the FUSE population, which, again, for the last 5 years, if not more, have been living in jails, shelters, the hospital, etc., where, as many of you know, they'll develop behaviors that make perfect sense in those settings to protect themselves, to survive, but are antithetical to being in a community setting. And so really being in an environment where they're forced to interact with their peers and they're forced to learn how to interact with their peers, we feel is vital for sort of learning those skills that are necessary for independence. They learn how to talk about issues of concern in an appropriate way, how to resolve conflict, how to set boundaries. I mentioned that we have a 100% success rate in the first year of the program. The 4 out of 27 negative outcomes that we've had have been in the second and third year, but we have many people who are now in their 5th and 6th year in the program. So one of the things that we've found is that the first year is very intensive. So obviously people come in and they have a lot of needs. And again, as many of you who are in the field know, people who are coming into a community setting for the first time in a long time, they're acting out, they're testing the boundaries, they're uncomfortable, and they're purposefully trying to get rearrested sometimes. All of those things are happening. But at the same time, they're also very motivated. So their level of engagement is very high. And as a result, again, and with the help of extremely dedicated staff, the first year, everybody has sort of made it through. What happens then, I think, in the second and third year, I'll sort of stretch the analogy a little bit, but it's a little bit like quitting smoking. I smoked for a long, long time, and I quit 15 times before it took, right? So the first 14 times, what happened? I quit for a month, I quit for 2 months, so I thought, I'm no longer hooked. Now I can have 1, I can have 2, and of course, within a month or so, right, I was, right. Some of you know, right, what I'm talking about. So I think in a certain way, again, and I apologize if I'm stretching the analogy, but in a certain way, I think that's what happens after the first year. So a lot of people, they've done a lot of hard work. They've gotten through that first year. It's been really scary. It's been really tough. But they've made it, and they've gotten some comfort level. So second year comes, and they decide, well, I don't necessarily want to go down and see my case manager once a week or twice a week. I don't necessarily want to go to the support group every week. But the problem is that, because it's been 5 years and often 10 years that they've been going back and forth between street and shelter, jail and shelter, et cetera, that 1 year has really not been enough time for them to really get their feet for the level of independence that they need and that they want. And so for many of them, it's that second and third year where they start experiencing some greater difficulties because they start pulling back and they're a little bit less engaged. And what we've seen is sort of when they get over that hump and you get into and they've made it, and then suddenly the fourth year, fifth year, that's when things sort of start to stabilize, and they need support, and things certainly come up, but that's when we have seen that they've been able to step down to sort of our general services. And that's sort of how we would conceptualize the program, that I think when Fuse started, it was originally thought of as a one-year initiative, and I think our experience is that it really, for the mental health population, needs to be a 3-year initiative before people really have that sort of grounding underneath them. The only other thing I'll add is that we've been talking about some of the cost savings, and I think it can't be said enough. We've very, very conservatively estimated, just looking at the 27 individuals, what their histories were in the 5 years before coming to us, and then the fact that they've been able to maintain their housing since coming to us, that the cost savings associated with their staying in stable housing as opposed to being in jail and shelter for that period of time has been about $1.8 million in taxpayer funds. And so again, we think that that's a fairly conservative estimate of the cost savings and is certainly replicable, hopefully,